Hello and welcome to this episode of Military History Inside Out. In today's episode, I speak with Dr. Bert Gordon, who's written a book on tourism in France during the occupation of World War II, and then afterwards, tourism, military history-related tourism, all through the creation of heritage in France. So thank you and enjoy. I'm speaking with Dr. Bertram Gordon, author of War Tourism, Second World War France from Defeat and Occupation to the Creation of Heritage. Thank you for speaking with me.
Oh, my pleasure.
So first, tell me, how did you get into studying and writing on this subject?
Well, it's a bit of a story, which actually goes really back to the 1960s. When I first started teaching, late 60s, 67, 68, I was teaching at Brooklyn College, and I got interested in the issue of fascism and the far right, partly because since I refused to take part in a violent demonstration against the police, this would have been in the time of the Columbia events, Columbia University, that is, one of my colleagues said, "Oh, you must be a fascist." And so I thought, well, this is kind of interesting. What does it really mean to be a fascist? Anyway, to make a long story short, a couple of years later, I ended up at Mills College in Oakland, which is where I am now. And I began investigating. I thought, well, there's in the issue of fascism, there was some sort of idealism. However, I thought it was misplaced. And I became interested in European fascist movements that did not have to sort of sully their hands by coming to power, which meant to me two countries, Romania and France. And for all kinds of reasons, since I knew French, didn't know Romanian, this was the Romania of Ceausescu, it seemed more practical to focus on France. So I spent several summers in France interviewing former collaborators. I had some introductions, etc., and wrote a book that was published in 1980 on the collaborationists in France during the Second World War. I was going to come up with like a personality structure to show what kind of person became, and I'm using the word now loosely, a fascist. Of course, I couldn't do it. They were all, in many ways, ordinary, nice people in a private sort of sense. Anyway, this got me interested in World War II France, and I've done a lot of other things since. What led me to tourism was that I got interested in tourism in general, and then in the mid-90s, I was researching something else in Paris in the Bibliothèque Nationale, the French National Library, and I found copies of a German guide to Paris, Der Deutsche Wegleiter, the German guide to Paris, essentially, although all of France. It's a little magazine published, as it turned out, every 2 weeks for 4 years during the occupation. And in many ways, looking at this booklet or this magazine, you'd never know there was a war on. So I completely dropped what I was doing and started investigating this. This got me interested because I'd never dreamt of anything like war tourism. And nobody, I should just add, nobody had written anything about it at the time. So that's what initially got me interested.
Mm-hmm. So then tell me, how do you lay out the book? Do you go chronologically during the occupation, or do you hit different themes throughout?
Well, primarily chronologically. I start out the book with a chapter on the development of Paris pre-World War II. The development of Paris as a tourist icon, and this goes back to the second half of the 19th century. The development of railways, the emergence of basically the emergence of Paris, the building of the Eiffel Tower, for example, symbolic in the centennial of the French Revolution, Expo of 1889. I talk about that. Then I get into the subject of the war and the German soldiers stationed there, and more or less do it chronologically because as a German soldier stationed in Paris in 1940 or 41, the experience was somewhat different, to say the least, than, let's say, in late 43 or 44 when the war fortunes had changed. So I do that. Then I have a chapter on the French touring in their own country, which is largely vacationing and whatever, and I can talk about that at greater length if you like, which also surprised me a little bit because with France being 3/5 of it was occupied until 1942, and then the rest of it was occupied. The Germans are there, war restrictions, rationing of all kinds, and yet people are going on vacations and and in effect going on tour. Obviously less so than before the war. Then the next part of the book deals with post-war tourism of memory. That is to say, people who go back to France, well, French, of course, and Germans and Americans, people who go back to visit the war sites. It's a little bit different from the first form of tourism, but I was advised by a number of people to combine it all in one book. So we go on to post-war tourism of memory and then kind of a look back. So it's roughly chronological.
Mm-hmm. And does that include, I know visiting Normandy, for D-Day celebrations is a big deal for many people. Do you?
Oh yeah, that there's a whole section on Normandy.
Mm-hmm.
I was very fortunate also because I have friends up there, and which I hate to say this I think it was 10 years ago already. I was in France for an extended period, and I contacted one of my friends, who's a retired lycée instructor, just telling him what I was doing, and I told him I wanted to visit a couple of sites and take a look at my list and tell me if I'm missing anything. Mm-hmm. So he emailed me back. We were in Paris at the time. He emailed me back and said, well, I'll take you around. And he did, and introduced me to some other local people, and so got some interesting perspectives, including, for example, a visit to the German military, one of the German military cemeteries there. There were a couple.
Are they? Huh. That's yeah. I never thought about that, about German cemeteries in France.
Yeah. Well, apparently every country, every government has its own policy regarding where they bury their war dead who are killed abroad. In the American policy, from what I understand, I haven't studied this in great depth, but from what I was told, the American policy is to repatriate the remains whenever possible. So that if you have an American soldier killed abroad somewhere, the U.S. tries at some point to repatriate the remains.
Can I interrupt for one moment? I had a little glitch. Can you go back to where you were talking about every country has its own policy about war dead?
Yeah, what I've been told, and as I was saying, I haven't researched this in great depth, but each government has its own policy regarding repatriation or lack of repatriation of the war dead. So for the United States, the American government will make every reasonable attempt, if a soldier or GI is killed in action somewhere around the world, to bring the remains back and have them buried in the United States. I was told that the British policy is somewhat different. They just have them buried wherever they're killed. Now, I could be wrong on this. The French and Germans worked out an arrangement post-World War II where the Germans were allotted or given, I'm not quite sure the details on this, a number of places where they could have cemeteries. And I think some of these German soldiers had been buried in other cemeteries and they were moved. And the one that I visited is La Cambe, C-A-M-B-E, in Normandy. And because I visited it with these local people, they knew the head of the cemetery. And so I got an interview and he told some really fascinating stories.
So I guess right at the end of the war, I would imagine it would have been difficult for these cemeteries to not be vandalized in some way, but I guess they survived the initial period of anger.
Well, in the case of France, I'll speak about that. Right at the time of the liberation, I can't say there was no vandalizing of any of these cemeteries. There probably was some, but I think that there was greater anger, if you like, taken out on people who were accused of people still alive, French people who were still alive, who were accused of collaboration. I was just writing about the women who had slept with German soldiers and were called horizontal collaborators. So I suspect that that's where a lot of the popular anger was directed. 44, 45, for example.
Mm-hmm. Now, speaking of that, in a sense, tourism could include soldiers going to places where they could have a good time. So,
absolutely.
So do you go into that in the book, as far as wild spots in France that Germans like to go to?
The archives, and we may get to this later, but one of the sources or collections of sources I used were the sources relating to the German army, based in Paris. And there were reams and reams of folders of documents relating to trying to police the brothels. The Germans selected certain brothels that they said were off limits to the French, or they had hygiene tests that they gave women to approve other brothels. There was some brothels that were supposed to be reserved for German officers and not the German privates or lower ranking military people. There was a huge amount of, shall we say, discussion of that.
So as far as moving about, I'm curious about the French who were able to continue to vacation during the war. I'd imagine with so much worries about resistance fighters, how much did that impact French movement around the country?
It does. I'm sorry.
Are you aware of that?
It does as time goes on, obviously. Just to give you an example of the French moving around, the Michelin guides were basically ceased publication during the occupation, which would not surprise anybody. But there were one or two that were published during the occupation. There's one, a guide to the Auvergne, sort of central southern France. And in it, I was just looking at this, so it's fresh in my mind. In it, in the frontispiece, the first page, it says, and I'm just paraphrasing very roughly, well, your car is asleep in the garage. In other words, you can't drive because you can't get gasoline, but your car's asleep, but it doesn't stop you from getting on a bicycle or walking, or maybe there's a bus available now and then, and go up into the mountains or go up and take a vacation. Now, there were good chunks of France. The seacoast, for example, was closed off by the Germans. So there were major areas, if you were a French citizen, you couldn't go. But if you were Parisian or somebody living in one of the cities, you could go up into the Alps, for example, if you could get there. And of course, getting there was something of a struggle. And I'm not pretending or arguing that the numbers of tourists were the same, let's say in 1941 or 2, that they had been pre-war. My point is they continued to go up there. And transportation was something of a problem, no question about it. But some people managed to pile into a car that somebody managed to, for however they did, to get coupons to get gasoline for. In other words, it wasn't totally zero. I do not have statistics. That would be kind of fun to get, but I don't know if they even exist. Hope I'm answering your question.
Oh, you did. Did the German soldiers have any kind of tourism related to World War I sites within France?
Yeah, less so. And I'm just trying to remember now. For example, Verdun was See, the problem with the World War I sites is that, well, I'm trying to say two things at one time, but a number of them, like Verdun, the Battle of Verdun was a French victory, so that didn't really attract lots of Germans. Mm-hmm. The tourist site that stands out in my mind, though, was the railway car with the Armistice of 1918 that ended World War I had been signed. And I tell the story in the book. Hitler probably, we think on the advice of Goebbels, when the French were defeated in 1940 and Marshal Pétain became the head of the government requesting an armistice, the Germans insisted that the armistice terms be signed in 1940 in the exact same railway car in the exact same place that they had been signed in 1918. Mm-hmm. And there are pictures, there's movies, films of Hitler exuberantly walking around. This is his greatest hour. So that became something of a tourist site. Then they trucked the train back. The railway car was then taken back to Berlin and shown off in Berlin. So it became something of a tourist site in Berlin for Germans there as well. As to other battleground sites, this gets back to the fundamental difference between the wartime tourism and the post-war tourism, because post-World War tourism is tourism to the battlefields to a large degree, memoir tourism. The tourism during the war by the soldiers, they weren't interested in wartime tourism. They were interested in seeing the sights or eating in good restaurants if they could, or visiting the brothels. So the idea of going to World War I battle sites was very, very minimal in terms of what I read.
Mm-hmm. Now,
For example, the magazine that I mentioned before, the Wegleiter, the German Guide to Paris, you look at it and you could be looking at something published today in terms, oh, they list the movie theaters, they list the good restaurants, they list the sights to see, plays that are going on, this sort of thing. You know, they're not really interested in World War I memorabilia.
So it's, you hear a lot about the resistance in France, but it sounds like the Germans soldiers, apart from areas where fighting was going on, it was pretty safe, it seems like.
Relative to the Russian front, absolutely. One of the accounts that I used is by Ernst Junger, Junger. Junger was a veteran of the First World War, and he was awarded medals for bravery in the First World War. In 1920, after World War I, he wrote a book. His memoirs in the First World War was widely read in Germany, Stahlgewitter, Storm of Steel in the English translation. He was stationed back in Paris again, and he spoke French, so he wasn't your typical German soldier. He was a literary figure, quite well educated. He was stationed back in Paris, and he was also serving for a while on the Soviet front. And of course, the difference was night and day. And you see it in his descriptions. In Paris, he was going out to eat and eating well, and Russian front was a wholly different thing. And many of the German soldiers who did end up serving, at least for a while in France, Paris particularly, were soldiers who were being transferred away from the Russian front to give them a little rest and rehabilitation. So, and they all knew it too. So yeah, if you were a soldier or military officer in Germany during the Second World War, you much preferred to be, well, prior to Normandy, of course, you much prefer to be stationed in France than the Eastern Front, no question.
Did you get a sense of how much French businesses were trying to cater to German tastes, to attract them to these different sites, or did you find anything about that?
Yes, I did. In the archives, for example, the Wegleiter, I never had a chance to get to really the nuts and bolts of who exactly was publishing it, but I'm pretty sure that it was French people publishing it, even though it was in German, or helping publish it, to appeal to the German occupation forces. And I still remember one little letter that I found kind of by accident in the folder with the Wegleiter, which was from a French person, local French person, writing to the one of the German military officers saying, "Don't use so-and-so's guide. Mine is better. Mine is the really authentic one." And in the archives, I started with the Wegleiter with this guide, and then when I realized how extensive this tourism appeared to have been, I went back to the archives and looked through the German military records, and you would see examples of French business people, restaurateurs, shopkeepers, sometimes sending letters to the German officers saying, shop at our shop or come to our restaurant. We're happy to serve the soldiers, this kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Were those businesses after the war, or right as the war ended, were they punished as collaborators in any sense, or did they get a pass for just being business?
It's a great question, and I don't have a lot of evidence one way or the other, which makes me think, unless proven otherwise, I would say that the people who may have suffered more were the people who were active political collaborators, women who were accused of sleeping with the German soldiers. You get into sexuality, which really motivated people. A lot of these business interests, so far as I know, just kind of quietly went on. And of course, the French, after the liberation, especially after the war, were eager to just get back to the economy and back to a successful economy, back to, you might call, normal life as quickly as possible. I think in most of the cases, these people sort of were quietly sort of got by.
Now, how about moving about the country? The German soldiers, did you find that it was train, automobile, or how did they get about the country?
Largely train. Yeah, of course the German soldiers had their mechanized vehicles, but most of those were being used at the front So this would have been the Soviet front, of course. And this goes back to your earlier question, too, about the French going on vacation, and I'm using the term a little bit loosely. The trains, by and large, continued to run, be it, again, changed schedules and whatever. So to a large degree, that would have been how any of these people got around.
Mm-hmm. Was there were there any sites that became more profitable with the Germans there, and others that became less? You know, was there some that were sort of Germans were dissuaded from going to, or did you see anything like that? A change in the tourist industry during the war, as far as where people
went. The interesting thing is that by and large, and I'm focused on Paris now, because of course, one of the changes, of course, was you couldn't, if you were French, you couldn't really go to the coast.
Right.
You couldn't go down to, down to the Atlantic coast, for example, which is where a lot of tourists and vacationers would have gone before the war, because the Germans closed off the entire coast. You couldn't necessarily go up to Normandy, to the coast of Normandy, for the same reason. As far as the Germans were concerned, let's see, your question was more or less. What struck me, and I spell this out in the beginning of the chapter that really deals with the Germans during the war, is that they pretty much imbibed, if that's the best word, the imagery of Paris as a tourist center prior to the war. In other words, they were going to the same types of places that civilian tourists of all kinds would have been going to prior to the war. The restaurants, the Eiffel Tower, just to give you some of the obvious examples, the Tuileries gardens. And that's what sort of surprised me somewhat, the sort of continuity. Most of these soldiers were young guys. One of them, I remember writing later on, wrote after the war about his experiences there, and again, I'm not quoting exactly, but close to it. And we got to see things we'd never expected to see in our lifetime. For example, riding in the metro. German soldiers could ride free on the metro in Paris. All you had to do is be a German soldier, walk into the metro, go wherever you want to. Now, again, these are in the early years, late 40, 41, 42. As resistance activities intensified in Paris as well as elsewhere, increasing areas were closed. The Germans themselves, German authorities themselves, closed increasing areas. They began restricting where the metro would go, for example, because they couldn't police all the stations. So that tightened up a little bit. But basically, I'm reminded of, and I cite this, William L. Shirer, who's known for his book Inside, he's an American correspondent in Berlin in the 30s. He wrote Inside the Third Reich, which is this huge book like this that's still widely read. And one of his books, Berlin Diary, is his diary, his account of his being a reporter for, I think it was CBS, in Berlin. And he accompanied the German forces into Paris when they occupied Paris as a correspondent. There are pictures of him sitting there near the Eiffel Tower. I'm not sure if I'm right, but sitting in Paris with his typewriter, typing up his notes. And within days of the arrival of the German soldiers in Paris, he's typing up, and this is in his book, that it seemed, he said, like all these soldiers had cameras with them, and they were behaving like tourists. They were wandering around taking pictures of the Eiffel Tower, the Arc de Triomphe, the Seine, all of the tourist attractions, the pre-war tourist attractions. This is continuity that caught my interest.
I can imagine the older, maybe German soldiers who had been in World War I, just mentally comparing what they went through in World War I compared to World War II, where they just literally almost walked into France and Paris.
Well,
of
course, in World War I, they never even got to Paris.
Right.
Yeah. No, World War I was a totally different experience because they spent 4 years slogging it out as I'm sure you know, the trench warfare on the front. And that would be an interesting project probably for somebody else, but to see if in the sliver, the area of northeastern France that the Germans did occupy for the 4 years during the First World War, what, if any, tourism? I'm going to guess there was some. The Germans, for example, occupied Alsace and Lorraine. Well, they already had Alsace and Lorraine. The French took them back after World War I. So There might have been some, but nothing like what happens in World War II. Totally different situation.
Yeah.
You have to conquer the area first, then you can send your troops wandering all over the place. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought about Paris being that open. Um, so what about the
Well, there
museums?
were incidents. There were incidents. There were attacks by the resistance, and then the Germans, Keitel, German commander, was it Keitel or was it Brauchitsch? Brauchitsch, excuse me, with the German commander in Paris for a while, issues orders that eventually, I think they say for every German civilian or every German, excuse me, who's killed by a resistance fighter, they're going to kill 100 hostages. So there was violence even in the early days. The earliest attacks on Germans in the fall of 1940, for example. But by and large, at least for the first couple of years, they were pretty much able to go where they wanted to, when they wanted to.
Hmm. So as far as the museums, there's the whole thing about the Germans looting museums and bringing treasures back to Germany. Did did the French museums suffer like this, or how did that work out?
They did, and private collections suffered. Of course, any artwork that belonged to Jews was subject to confiscation. And I might add, as you may well know, that the French authorities, the Vichy authorities, sometimes participated in these types of things as well. Um, Probably the best known stories regarding the Germans in the museum is the Louvre, where Rose Valland, who worked there, secretively hid a number of the items and managed to hide things for 4 years from the Germans. Goering, for example, famously visited Paris, and Goering prided himself, Hermann Goering, as being the sort of cultural, how shall I say, not cultural minister, but the cultural expert, art expert of the leaders of the Third Reich. So he would visit Paris and sort of designate things that he thought should be taken back to Germany.
Mm-hmm.
There in the archives, I found records of other German officials traveling through France designating materials that they thought should be removed to Germany as well. Um, I'm sure some were, and some probably weren't as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, before we go on to what you used to do your research, are there any other parts of the book we haven't touched on that you might want to mention?
Well, I think the overarching thing that struck me in doing it, um, and as I continue to think about it, was the what I call the linkages between war and tourism, because that's something I hadn't really thought about prior to getting involved in this project.
Mm-hmm.
So I sort of hope that the book will help stimulate. I've collected materials on tourism and war in general since I've been working on the book. Obviously, not nearly to the degree that I have on the France in the Second World War. Uh, but I'm kind of hoping to help launch a little cottage industry, you might say, of people who recognize that tourism is a major aspect of human activity that is not all that new. It doesn't begin with the grand tour of the English gentleman going to Renaissance Italy, as some have pretended,
Yeah.
uh, and that it continues during wartime. You read the general histories of tourism in France. I'm thinking of a number of French books I'd read even before starting this project, and it's as if they sort of end in 1939 with the war and they begin again in 1945 after the war. And it just doesn't work that way. So I'm hoping that the book uh, uh, sort of helps spread that to those people interested in studying tourism, culture generally.
Mm-hmm. Now so you talked about some of the resources you used for your research. What other sort of archives or other materials did you use for the research?
Well, I started with the French National Library. I started, of course, with the German guide, the Wegleiter that I mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, how many of them were there? They appeared every 2 weeks for 4 years. So that's about 25 times 4, 70 issues, 60, 70 issues, something like that. So that became the first thing that I used. Then, of course, I started looking for everything that I could find published that would be in the Bibliothèque Nationale, the BNF, the French National Libraries in Paris. And there were quite a number of guidebooks, a series of guidebooks published by Ode, ODE, accent Ague, guidebooks to France, one guidebook to Western France published in 1942. So I used largely the guidebooks. Then as I got into that, there was an article in the German guide that said something to the effect, they claimed that we've given 1 million tours to German soldiers and personnel. This was in mid to late 41. And lo and behold, I found in the archives, the German military archives, because when the Germans fled in 1944, they left a lot of their archives in Paris. They couldn't take it all, obviously, tons and tons of archives. So the French archives, the French National Archives, well, now it's suburban Paris, have dozens and dozens of cartons and folders of German military, police, whatever, archival materials. And so I started going through those related to tourism, and I found out that the German army, the Wehrmacht, had a special unit whose job it was to arrange tours for the Germans who were there. And that, in fact, they had statistics, I think it was a monthly basis or weekly basis. No, it must have been a weekly basis of how many tours they had given per week to both mainly soldiers, but also there were civilian business people and whatever in Paris coming from Germany. And again, I may be a little bit off on this because I haven't looked at the statistics recently, but between the fall of 1940 and the summer of 1941, I think, according to their figures, they gave something like 800,000 tours. So in other words, to answer your question, a lot of archival material, largely the published travel literature, the guidebooks, this sort of thing. Some of the magazines that were published, some of the French magazines, Paris Toujours was one, for example, continued to be published. Paper was in short supply. Of course, the Germans had as much paper as they wanted, but paper for the French was in very short supply. So the newspapers and magazines, some of them discontinued. The ones that continued generally were smaller or fewer pages than they'd been. But the Paris programs, for example, was published straight through the war. So this gave something of the French perspective. Again, the shows in Paris, the restaurants, this type of thing. So I used those. Those were the main sources of research that I used. And, wherever I could find, the one thing I would love to have been able to find more of would have been individual accounts, like handwritten accounts by soldiers who kept diaries, for example. Well, today we went to see the Eiffel Tower, and this is what I thought. Wasn't really able to get a lot of that kind of stuff, but wherever I got snippets of it, I did. I mentioned Junger, for example. There were a couple of other people, other German officers, who published their memoirs of being in Paris during the war, post-war, of course. So I used those as well. And then, of course, for the latter part of the book, the post-war tourism, there it becomes, again, there's a lot of tourism literature, pamphlets, for example. You start getting published pamphlets inviting people to come tour Normandy by as early as 1945, 46, as I recall. Come see the battle sites. So that stuff. There are archives up in Normandy, historic. It's called the Monument for Peace in Caen in Normandy. I use their archives, and it helps. Some of the archivists were kind of nice, and they say, "Oh, you're interested in this? Well, here's some things we don't normally, normally you don't get to see." So I got to see some pamphlets and tourism literature of that sort. And then it became a question, of course, as we get more and more toward the present, you get simply a greater and greater quantity, including more recently using the internet and tours to Normandy and what people go see, and of course a little bit of my own experience, and then the last thing I should mention are the interviews, interviewing the, as I said, the commander. I'm not sure, his title was not commander, but the head of the German military cemetery, the one I mentioned before. He had stories to tell that were absolutely amazing. And so some interviews as well. It's kind of how I put it together.
Yeah, I was going to mention, I've come across a number of German World War II photo albums of Germans you see a lot of Greece, Egypt, they're looking at some of the sites, getting pictures, and I think I've seen a couple in France, just doing the whole tourist thing and snapping the pictures.
Well, here's an interesting anecdote that I could not have told you about even last week at this time, and that is I'm teaching a course now. I'm at Mills, basically, but I teach courses. Are you familiar with OLLI, Osher Lifelong Learning Institute?
No.
It's a national program. Very briefly, it's a national program funded by the Osher Foundation for people over 50 who just want to take courses for their personal enrichment, education, etc. A lot of colleges and universities across the country offer these courses, and I've been doing courses at Santa Clara University, in the San Francisco Peninsula for a number of years. They asked me to do a course on World War II France. And so it's a 4-week course, meets every Friday for 2.5 hours. We started this past Friday. So after the class, one of the women came up to me and she said, my father was in the American Army and he was among the first soldiers who landed in Normandy. And I have pictures of him. Would you like to have copies of the pictures? Yes, of course, after I stopped salivating. Yeah, of course. And so she emailed me, I think 2 days ago, she emailed me some of these pictures. There's one picture there are 4 or 5 soldiers, I'm not sure, American soldiers, I'm not sure if any of these are her father or not. They're standing in front of the Eiffel Tower. It's almost the exact image of the German soldiers standing a few years earlier in front of the Eiffel Tower that I used for my book. My God, I wasn't surprised, but it was really dramatic. Yeah, that's what they do.
Yeah.
Yeah, which reminds me, I should add one other thing also.
Sure.
We've been focusing, of course, on the Germans, but I do have the section on the Allied soldiers following the liberation. Right after June of 44, I guess it's the summer of 44, there was a publication that began appearing in English called For You. And it was monthly, if I recall, and it didn't appear for that long, 4 or 5 months. I actually managed to get copies of it. I managed in antiquarian stores in Paris. The Wegleiter is impossible to find, but the For You I was able to buy copies of. So I actually have copies of them. And again, it was striking to see the similarities, again, to how to get to the Eiffel Tower, the same sorts of things that the Germans had been doing a few months before you now have the English and American soldiers doing.
And the French business owners just roll with it.
They just roll with it. I think I mentioned a little bit earlier the one guidebook that had come out in German in early 44, and then it reappeared in English in late 44. What happened between early? Well, I'm kidding, but it was almost word for word translation from German to English.
Interesting. So, and I guess you mentioned you visited some of the sites that you write about, or you get to see some of them.
Normandy, we spent quite a bit of time there with these friends. Oh, they were fantastic. Yeah, we visited the American military cemetery too, not just the German. The beaches, of course, the museums in Paris, the Jean Moulin Museum, the Leclerc Museum. Where else? We were out in Brittany a number of years ago visiting there. Let me just see. Yeah, I spent some time. This goes back a few years now. I spent some time in Vichy, of course, in the town of Vichy, which, of course, plays a key role in all of this, and fortunately managed to be hosted for a while by the local historian there who's written, I don't know how many books about the history of Vichy. And, of course, there you get into a whole different sort of thing. I also spent an evening with a guy who had made a film a couple of years before, L'année dernière à Vichy, the last year in Vichy, which was being shown all over France. So we wandered around the town of Vichy, for example, and I took lots of pictures and visited as many places as I could. There are obviously sites I didn't get to see, but managed to cover at least quite a number of them.
Yeah, I've interviewing other authors who've studied or wrote on wartime France, have noted how fascinated the French still are with that period.
Very much. Yeah, one of the things I think I have in the book, possibly in the introduction, I think it's in there, is that at least when I was putting the book together, and I don't think it has changed, there were more doctoral dissertations being written in France, that is, on World War II than any subject except the French Revolution. It was the number 2 popular subject among academic graduate students, in essence, writing doctoral dissertations. There continues to be a fascination with it. And in fact, there's an interest in it in this country too. There was an op-ed piece in the New York Times. I don't have it with me, unfortunately. I think it was 2 or 3 days ago. I could send you the link if you're interested. That starts out, it's don't remember who wrote it, but it's talking about the industry of shame. And in it, the writer is talking about contemporary United States, where everybody seems to be trying to out everybody else. Oh, the things you did wrong 20 years ago, and on social media and all this sort of thing. And he's criticizing this. But he starts out by talking about the experience he ran into when he was visiting somebody in England years ago, and a maid came out in this English person's house, and he said, I recognized this woman and I couldn't recognize where she was from. And then he realized it was the same woman he had seen paraded naked in the streets of a small town in France shortly after the liberation. And this was in the New York Times 2 or 3 days ago.
Mm-hmm.
So even in this country, but obviously in France, there continues to be a really, I dare say, strong interest. Most of the people go about their lives, they're not sitting there agonizing over World War II, but there's an interest in it, no question.
Can you give me one moment? I need to change the battery on one of my recorders.
If you do that, I just want to, somebody phoned me on my phone. I'll just check and see who that was.
Oh, sure thing.
Hi, dear. Can I call you back in a few minutes? I'm in the middle of the interview. Okay, how are you doing? Okay. Still here.
All right. Let's see. All right. Okay. All right. What part of the research did you find most enjoyable?
This will sound strange, but I really enjoyed it all. But if I had to do an answer to your question, I guess it would have been the German guide, that Wegleiter, because I kept going through it, and possibly because it was the first real chunk of research I did on the project, it just kept saying to me over and over again, kept sort of surprising me over and over again, this is all going on during wartime. I was thinking of you go to London or Paris, you get the equivalent of what I think it's called What's On, what's going on today, shows to see and all of this. I just really couldn't. And even now, years later, because that was where I started, it's still, I won't say I can't say I'm surprised. I've been working with it long enough, but it really was interesting for me to read. And I'll just add one thing. There were little vignettes in that magazine written by Germans. I remember a couple about German soldiers who had been in France. You're right, you mentioned this before, in World War I, and had now come back to France. And of course, they weren't talking about tourism per se. They were talking about their personal reminiscences and experiences. And they sort of had the flavor. They were in German. They had the flavor of the kinds of articles you might have read in Life magazine or Look magazine in the 40s and 50s at the same time. And I'm old enough to remember some of these things. So I guess if I had to pick one specific aspect of it, I'm tempted to go on and say but I'll stop at this point, leave you with the one.
Mm-hmm. One of the things, like research like yours, the way it strikes me is life seems like it was just so normal then, and then you had World War II. It's like it could happen again today. I think people think that World War II was some evil that swept across the land suddenly, whereas in fact it was just a lot of normal people ended up doing some horrible things.
Well, that's it. What was it? Christopher Browning's book, Ordinary Men, talking about the Germans and the SS and whatever. And this is what I kind of learned when I interviewed, this goes back to the previous book I was talking about, the people who had been involved in the collaboration. And, I interviewed people who had signed up. There was a French unit of the Waffen-SS that fought in Russia. And I interviewed a number of survivors, people who had volunteered for this unit, the Waffen-SS, and they were the people I spoke to. We were fighting the communists, we were fighting the Jews, and they were convinced, and this was in the 70s when I was interviewing these people, that, that they had done the right thing. And on a human level, ordinary level, I'll just tell you one little anecdote. One guy I was interviewing actually in the late 80s. I'd already written the book, but I had a contact, and I thought, you never throw away an interview. Why? So he was willing to see me. Visited him in his apartment in Paris. He gave me wine. He was as nice and genteel as could be. And this guy had been in the Waffen-SS, participating in all these things in the invasion of Russia and whatever. Anyway, after a couple of hours, it was time to leave. It had started to rain. Hadn't been. So I had a few blocks walk to the metro. He insisted on walking with me, carrying an umbrella so that I not get wet. And, I just try to add it all up. We talk about ordinary people. This guy was not a devil or something, just an ordinary guy who got involved in these not so ordinary, hopefully not so ordinary things, really. Yeah.
Exactly. What did you find that was most surprising?
Good question. Surprising, probably the most surprising thing of all was the whole theme altogether. I was not expecting to find out that there was wartime tourism going on. And then when, I focused on the Germans, then I thought, well, I want to expand it. What are the French themselves doing at home? And I started looking through whatever I could, and again, talk about being surprised. I remember finding a little journal called the French Hotelier, the French Hotel Journal, I guess, something to that effect. And it's talking about how you should come up to the mountains, come up to the hills, eastern France. They're available. You can get there, train, whatever. The date. I think the title of the article is "Where to Spend Your Vacation." The date was June 5th, 1944. That's one day before before D-Day. Yeah. And by that time, I'd done enough research not to be fully surprised. But again, it was just kind of these things really kind of surprised me that as many people as were doing these things. And then there were French hostelries that I have some statistics that a couple of thousand people would travel out, a couple of hundred, in the course of a year to visit some of these places. So I had come into this thinking that everybody was sort of hunkered down, and I found out it wasn't quite so simple as that.
Of all the difficult questions you had to answer, or were trying to answer in this book, which one perhaps was the most difficult to get at?
Probably the individual reactions themselves. As I said, had I had unlimited time and resources, possibly I might have been able to get to interview some more people, get access to some private diaries. But if I could replay it, so to speak, and had the resources, those would have been the most difficult things. It's a story of tourism studies in general, but maybe cultural studies in general, is that it's much easier to study the emitting sources, the publications, the people providing the services. They publish, they're in the public eye, than the recipients. Fine, here's a group of German soldiers. I have pictures of them in front of the Eiffel Tower or somewhere else. What are they thinking?
Yeah.
Maybe there were 20 of them, and maybe 2 of them are keeping a diary or something. Those were the types of things that I would love to have been able to get access to, assuming they exist.
Right.
And with thousands and thousands of people involved, I'm sure there are some of them.
Yeah. They're in attics somewhere, some of these.
In attics. Yeah, like the story of this woman I was telling you about a few minutes ago. Now, her father was in the American military. I think she told me she's got letters that he wrote. So, I didn't want to be obnoxious and say, well, I want to see the letters. But I said, whatever you do, don't destroy those letters. Keep those letters. They're valuable historical sources. We'll see what happens.
They are, yeah. What most emotionally moved you? And that could either be positive or negative in this research.
Well, the most positive emotional thing that moved me was that I was able to get it done at all. I was very happy about that. Able to get it done, put it into a book, get it published. Life begins at home. On a broader scale, negatively, again, you were talking about this too a little while ago. Um, People could live in their cocoons, in their private worlds, and this is true today.
Yeah.
All sorts of horrible things are going on around the world, and it's not to say that as an individual I can control them, but things that go on that maybe if I and you and a few people get together, we can have some influence. These people were living their lives. Um, it's hard to condemn them. They were just ordinary people, as the phrase goes, living their lives as best they could. In retrospect, though, I guess what the result for me is it sort of reinforced a view that I have that war and violence is about as natural to human beings as cuisine, as eating. Reviewing some manuscripts on food history, which is an area I work in. Although the statistics seem to indicate that there have been fewer quote unquote wars in recent years than prior, but there's certainly violence, and I guess I came away from it thinking that again the ordinary that there is the violence in ordinary people, either doing it, perpetuating it, accepting it, turning a blind eye to it, and maybe in my next book I'll have the magic cure for it, but don't hold your breath.
Yeah, it's culture during war is fascinating. Like you said, it's cultural studies, but I wonder if there's sort of a mix, military and cultural history, you know.
There should be. There
Yeah.
really should be. I'm thinking of this guy from a museum in Germany who made a visit to France, and how do I know about it? Because he kept a diary. In fact, he had illustrations. He drew pictures. He was looking at architecture in different parts of France, things that he was thinking that he was on a commission. He was an official for a cathedral in Western Germany. I'm forgetting now exactly which city. Anyway, his written records are in the French National Archives. So I was able to get to see them. And he talks about visiting these places and then draws sketches of them and what he's going to bring home to Germany, this sort of thing. It's and in fact, the German cultural attaches prided themselves, talked about they claimed that they were protecting French treasures. Goes back also to one of your earlier questions, that they were protecting French art treasures better than the French themselves were.
Mm.
And there are some examples that indicate they probably did, but then of course we have the counter examples as well. So you're right, there's this real connection between war and so many activities that we think of as, well, we tend to think of as not related to war.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you did mention what you hope the book will do for readers, to give them a sense of what we're talking about. Is there anything else you'd like the book to impact in any way?
Well, I hope they find it interesting. I hope it helps expand people's horizons a little bit in the subject we were just talking about in terms of war and tourism, things that go on, that war isn't just dropping bombs or shooting, that there are a lot of other things that go on as well, even at the front and certainly behind the front. Perhaps it, just by opening some questions, I don't pretend this book is going to revolutionize the world. People, hundreds of millions of people will read it and then put an end to war. It would be nice if it did, but it won't. But for people looking at it, reading through it, to sort of realize that some of these questions of cultural history in general, who we are as human beings, how we've become who we are historically, are somewhat more complex and interrelated than perhaps they may have thought of at first. And, if I can get some people thinking in those terms, I think that maybe I've done my job.
I think also I wonder how much shame develops among people when they have the enemy coming in and just having fun, in their backyard, essentially. So, so in one sense, your book is a study of the history of this activity, but in another, someone could pick it up. A French person could be fascinated, but also shamed by what you describe.
By what happens, yes, absolutely. I haven't yet had that reaction. Of course, the book just came out a couple of months ago, so we'll see. But yeah, it's possible. Of course, we're now 70 years past the war.
Mhm.
We will see, because yeah, it describes people in France. The section on the Germans touring in France describes people in France making themselves available.
Mhm.
That leads me to the issue then, and you may have come across this too. This is not exactly war tourism, but it ties into it. I've seen estimates of 100 to 200,000 babies born of French women by German soldiers
Mhm.
during the Second World War, during the occupation.
Mhm.
And in fact, there, to my knowledge, I think there's actually an organization of these people. These people would now themselves be in their 70s,
Mhm.
who have in essence had to go through their entire lives stigmatized for something that they had no responsibility for.
Mhm.
And every so often you see a newspaper article or something about one of these people. And one of them, I remember saying, yeah, I didn't pick who my parents were, and yet I get blamed it was a guy, I get blamed as the son of a French woman and a German soldier. And so, yeah, for people to think about all of this and maybe have also a little bit more charity, put blame where blame is due and not on the innocent people. But, back to the earlier point, yeah, there were people who were willing to sell tourism items, trinkets, for example. There are people I know selling tourism trinkets around the Eiffel Tower. There are today, buy little models of the Eiffel Tower for a few euro, whatever. There were then too, selling to the tourists before the war, selling to the Germans who came during the war, selling to the Allies who came after the war.
Mhm. How would you, ratio-wise, what part of the book deals what during World War II and how much afterwards?
Um, Probably, well, as I say, the first chapter is pre-World War II, sort of setting the scene. It's, if you consider World War II as both the Germans and the French themselves, it's probably, if it isn't half, it's close to half. It's
Mm,
probably roughly 50-50.
okay.
There's a little story behind that too. I'm a core member of the Tourism Studies Working Group at the University of California in Berkeley, right nearby.
Okay.
And this is a group of academics, graduate students, professors, whatever, and often they're visiting people who are visiting at the university. We have meetings every 2 weeks or so. Somebody does a presentation. Anyway, I did a presentation for them uh, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, something like that.
Mhm.
And it was sort of like a summary of this book. And I was putting the book together. And at the end of the presentation, what's nice about it is we meet for 2 hours. So you talk for about an hour and a half. And then there's plenty of time for discussion. And there's some really well-informed people. There's some major figures in tourism studies. So at the end of my talk, as usual, you give a talk and then they ask for questions, and there's always a hesitation. Then one person raises a hand, they all raise their hands. So it took a minute or two, nobody raised a hand. So I said, great. I said, I have a question for you guys, bearing in mind that sitting in the audience, among other people, are somebody like Dean McCannell, who wrote a book in 1976 called The Tourist, which is just cited everywhere. Nelson Grayburn, also at UC Berkeley, who's written about tourism in Asia. He's an anthropologist. Dean is a sociologist, so different disciplines. Anyway, I said, my question for you is, I'm putting all this together, and I talked about the German soldiers in World War II tourism, and then talked about post-war tourism. Do you think this should be one book or two? Because there are different types of tourism. And they all said, oh, put it all together in one book on just the thematic of war and tourism. So that's what I did. I took their advice, and it sort of broke down. I think it's roughly 50-50. I'd have to look at the table of contents to be absolutely sure, but it's pretty close to half and half. The chapter on Germany is, I believe, the longest chapter in the book.
Mhm.
That's on German tourists, and then the chapter on the French tourists in their own country, French vacationers, etc., may be the second longest. And then the post-war chapters are a little bit shorter because I focus on Normandy and then I focus on some of the more recent stuff. So
Mhm.
again, probably too long an answer for your question, but roughly 50-50.
I feel bad because most of this interview has been about World War II. I feel like maybe we missed talking about some of the post-war tourism.
I'm not surprised, because most of the interest that I've seen, and again, this is anecdotal, people talking about it, most of the interest that I've seen seems to focus on the section on the Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that is probably, certainly this was my reaction when I first started doing the research, that would probably have been the most surprising to people, because nobody's surprised to say, well, there are a lot of people who go visit the Normandy battle sites,
Mm-hmm.
or whatever. I think what I have to say about them is interests people, but again, it may not have quite that element of surprise. Of, gee, I hadn't thought of this before, so I'm not at all surprised that we end up talking largely about the first section of the book.
Mm-hmm. Um, can you speak to any difficulties you had? Well, you have mentioned some difficulties in getting the book finished, some of the resources you'd have liked, but did you have any difficulties finishing it or publishing it?
Well, it took time. It took altogether. The first research was the mid '90s,
Mm.
and let's see, this will sound like an excuse, but I'll say it anyway. Teaching at a small liberal arts college, you don't have quite the focus on your research that you do at a major research university. You probably know this. So the good part, apart from the fact that I've enjoyed teaching at Mills all these years, is that I get different perspectives because I teach courses on different areas. To give you an example, over the years, I've also worked in cuisine history, doing a course right now in the history of cuisine.
Mm.
So a colleague and I, not at Mills, but in California, we put together a special issue of the journal French Historical Studies on the theme of what food studies can teach us about French history. And we collected articles. We were asked to do this by the editors. They said, well, you can probably publish 4 or 5 articles. You'll probably get 4 or 5 submissions. We got 27 submissions. We chose the ones we thought were most apropos. So that took a couple of years. So the point that I'm saying is there are a lot of different things coming, getting in, other distractions, which are all good. But it's one of the reasons why, in my situation, I couldn't churn this book out, let's say, in 2 years. In terms of difficulties, nothing really that stands out. I sent descriptions of it and parts of it to different publishers. The people at Cornell were very much interested in it. I was delighted to have them, Cornell University Press, I was delighted to have them take this interest, and so we just went with them. And then, of course, once we agreed, then they wanted some revision, which is normal in this process, and that took some time, and there you go.
Okay. What's your next writing project, or have you started on a next writing project?
Well, I'm sort of thinking about it, and I'm thinking, since I've put my foot in it already, I've actually begun collecting stuff, writing stuff from maybe a possible history of war tourism in general. That would be kind of immense. But I've just been collecting at the moment. I haven't had a lot of time to write. I'm technically retired from Mills as of last June 30th. But I'm teaching one course here. I'm teaching this course at Santa Clara, reviewing a couple of books and whatever else I'm supposed to be doing. I don't remember at this point. But I continue to collect on war tourism, and I was actually just looking through some of this stuff the other day. And I might just try to put something together on the linkages, that is, of war and tourism in general. And in fact, I proposed a paper with a couple of colleagues for the American Historical Association meeting, which will be next January in New York. We'll see if it gets accepted, where it's tourism in general, different aspects of tourism. And my paper would be on tourism actually watching war, because there are examples of people who went to tour and actually watched battles as they unfolded. To my knowledge, this did not happen in the Second World War. So I don't talk about that in the book. But Bull Run, for example, in the Civil War, you may know some of these stories. Cook's travel agency organized tours to the Crimea during the Crimean War. You could go on a Cook's ship and watch some of the battles unfold, and we have some written accounts of these things. So that's the immediate thing. We'll see if that gets accepted or not. That's just a sort of small part of it. But this issue continues to interest me, of the linkages of war and tourism, and maybe just a general sort of thing on it.
When you mentioned that, the two largest war tourism events I think of is Napoleon going into Egypt, conquer and bringing a whole slew of people to check it out and research it, and then Alexander the Great literally conquering areas just because he wanted to expand his knowledge.
He wanted to see them. Yeah, that's an aspect of it. And you mentioned Napoleon. There were people who were watching the Battle of Wellington the Battle of Waterloo
Mhm.
as it unfolded. So you've given me yet another idea. Sure, this could go on forever. Yeah,
It is it's a large topic.
it's a large topic, and there are a couple of people working in different aspects. I don't mean to say I'm the only one. I think the present book that we've been talking about, I think is unique. I don't know of anything else quite
Mhm.
quite on that subject, but there are other people who've talked about war and to battle. Well, the field of excuse me, the area of battlefield tourism, people going to see
Mhm.
battlefields,
Yeah.
that has attracted some literature.
Definitely. Um, so where can people find your work? Do you have
Well,
online presence or?
well, my best online presence, some of it seems to have disappeared. I actually, knowing you might ask me that question, LinkedIn
Mhm.
would be one, and I put together a kind of CV on something called Live Journal, and
Mhm.
I tried accessing it. I haven't really kept it up all that well. I tried accessing it again in preparation to be able to comment on it yesterday, and managed to access it a couple of times. I can read off I can send you the email links, or I can just read them off to you. You tell me what you prefer.
Well, I can just post them in the notes when I post this. I can just include the links if you want
Okay.
people to send you questions or whatever.
Okay, so then I should just send them to you.
Yeah, yeah, that's fine.
Okay, I can do that. Yeah, I have a Twitter account which
Mm.
I last used, I think, in 2015. Yeah, I believe in technology, and I'm still proud of the fact that at Mills, I was the first person to put together an academic paper using computers back in the mid 80s. I still take pride in that, but I leave the Twitter life to other people. Let's put it that way. But if there's a reason to, I can certainly use it. Yeah,
Mhm.
people wanted to contact me, I'd be happy to to respond.
Yeah, it's a
I will
and
send you these links. Then I'll email these links to you when we're done, and do what you want with them. Yeah.
okay. That's all I have. Do you have any final thoughts or words?
Well, first of all, thank you. Um, just in general, I guess if I have any advice to people, it's kind of like what I tell my students, and I learned this with this project, to really to be open. Well, 2 points. One is just to be open to something new when it sort of hits you in the face. I was not expecting ever to write on war and tourism, and then I found this German guide. Uh, and the other thing, and I have done some articles. I'm on the editorial board of Journal of Tourism History, which got started, I think it's 10 years ago. It's not 10, it's very just about 10 years. I think it was 2009. And I've done a couple of articles for them on the expansion of tourism studies in the academic world,
Mm,
and how, when I started, if you were a historian, you did political history,
mm,
and that was pretty much it.
mm,
And how that has changed over recent decades, whereby things like cuisine history, I was once called a huckster for offering to teach a cuisine history course at one of the Cal State universities in Los Angeles
uh-huh.
in the 70s. And now cuisine, I know we haven't really talked about it, but cuisine history is an established field, a lot of people doing it, it's respected
Mhm,
by many, if not all. Tourism history, I'm the only, quote, historian in the tourism studies working group. The other people are all from different disciplines: anthropology, sociology,
mm,
one or two people from architectural studies, literature. So I've seen the field of history open up, which I think has been a very good thing.
mhm.
And as I say, encouraging anybody who's watching this or listening to this to be open to something new when they come across it.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you for speaking with me.
Oh, enjoyed it.
This podcast has been presented by War Scholar. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to visit warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com for more great interviews and military history information. Your visits help support this podcast. One of the best ways to provide feedback for this podcast is to rate me on iTunes. Please give me a good rating if you liked it, or feel free to give me a bad rating if you didn't. I'll use that feedback to make this a better podcast. You can also follow me on Instagram under Cris Alvarez War Scholar. That's Cris without an H, Cris. On Facebook under War Scholar, on YouTube under War Scholar 1945, and on Twitter under War Scholar. Thank you, and I hope you return to this podcast for more great military history.